Our speaker today is Russel Zanca, who is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Northeastern Illinois University. He is the co-editor of the anthology Everyday Life in Central Asia, Past and Present. He's been taking a Central Asia class probably the last 5 or more years. You're familiar with this text. One of the chapters of which he authored, as well as a book called Life in a Muslim Uzbek Village, Cotton Farmer After Communism. If you've looked on the internet, you found him being interviewed on all types of different topics, ranging from Uzbekistan to broader interest in Central Asia. So I'm trying to
Thank you very much, Bart. I want to thank everybody who had a role in helping to bring me here and sponsor me here at the center and the various departments. So I'm very grateful to be here. I have to tell all of you that this is a very low-tech production, so nothing more than the spoken word. It's a Tuesday, so I figure people relatively have good attention spans. It's not Friday afternoon, right? Mm-hmm. And with the collective indulgence, I plan to read for a little more than 40 minutes. That's probably how long my paper's going to run. And then I hope we'll have ample time for Q&A. So, without further ado. In the 1980s, scholars who studied the USSR cynically viewed the certainty of unified national identity. This cynicism focused on the inability of the Soviet government to solidify its nation-state based on merged interests, the classic merger of nation with politics in the sense of Ernest Gellner, among ethnic groups, and the vague sense of common purpose manifested in ideologies purporting to maintain the relative health or togetherness of states. In other words, the USSR would not cohere long because it had created too much difference ethnically and regionally, rather than welding a unified polity in which the majority felt themselves to be stakeholders and beneficiaries. For Ron Sunni, all of the decades of building and reinforcing ethno-territorial units based on primordialist rationales, the Union Republics, rapidly transformed into territories of nationalist movements by the mid to late 1980s. He termed this revenge of the past. Or in the words of Zbigniew Brzezinski, former national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, among other things, quote, "The Soviet regime has created institutional vessels that can now easily be filled with nationalist content." The arguments as to why the Soviet experiment failed varied. Many claimed the country had been founded as little more than an extension of the Russian Empire, thus always bound to see non-Slavic Asian peoples as inferiors. Brzezinski also made that remark. Others saw communism as an impractical economic system that could not grow to provide increasing wealth and well-being to most. 2, some analysts saw the West as having been responsible for slowly strangling the USSR through its arms race, propaganda, and superior economic system that generated wealth and created all manner of better industrial and consumer goods. In fact, the anthropologist Marvin Harris weighed in on the overall failure of the sustainability of the system by claiming that it collapsed not because of its rivalry with the West, but because its development was so uneven. And this unevenness pertained as much to the inability to provide goods as it was reflected in vast differences in infant mortality rates between, say, Russia and Turkmenistan. As a graduate student in New York, close to the dissolution, I took a class from Edward Allworth, known in the US at that time as something of a Mandarin in Central Asian studies. Allworth, a man of passion for his interests and experiences in Uzbekistan, wrote and lectured about Central Asia and the Uzbeks as if they were about to emerge in the world as a powerful regional bloc or entity once the Soviet Union expired. I recall Professor Allworth talking at length about confederacy, one of his favorite words. He thought this would be a natural outcome after more than a century of Russian oppression of the peoples of Central Asia, whose illustrious history of religion, statecraft, workmanship, and fine arts had been suffocated under imperial rule. Moreover, the people of the Central Asian republics, so he and others argued, recognized themselves as allies linguistically, culturally, and religiously. They were, after all, so similar as Turkic-Muslim peoples, and even the Tajiks formed an important unifying force as part of a Turco-Persian ancestral fiber. Shortly after I left Columbia, I studied Uzbek at Indiana University with a teacher who had exiled himself from Uzbekistan, partly as a matter of political conscience, partly as a matter of his having taken bribes. He also advocated a Central Asian unity, with Uzbeks taking center stage, of course, based on their animosity toward Russia and their established traditions of craftsmanship, commercial enterprise, and so forth. Not only did Central Asians appear prepared for independence, but we students also learned that they champed at the bit to fulfill a sort of arrested destiny. As handfuls of Americans studying Central Asia and the Caucasus almost 25 years ago now, we had little reason not to be convinced that the miseries of communism were going to give way to free and vibrant countries because this conversion seemed so natural. Of course, we probably should have evaluated the opinion polls and plebiscites of the time more critically. These showed the Republican populations still supporting the Soviet Union by majorities. And we know today that there were several factors that accounted for that loyalty, including large and growing titular populations and the ability to keep the center, Moscow so to speak, as a strong economic patron. Moreover, as a consequence of being Soviet, a fact that at the time was more often denigrated than appreciated, Central Asians were educated, well-fed, and oriented more toward the West than toward Near Eastern, South Asian, and East Asian neighbors. Taken on the whole, furthermore, these were relatively prosperous, emerging countries in contiguous space that featured unifying similarities of culture in the broadest of senses. Over time, the populations of these territories bordering countries with which they had much in common historically, including Iran, Afghanistan, and China, would help form powerful commercial networks that would only enrich all new national participants involved. They were all about to play some role in the end of history. The changes that ensued with the fall of the Soviet regime to the societies and countries that are Central Asia more or less confirms an idea expressed, I think, by sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. He said, quote, "All major changes in our century have happened unexpectedly, and none of them could have been foreseen or deduced from statistical trends in advance." In retrospect, I know that my lack of appreciation for communism would prove a considerable irony once I began undertaking research in Uzbekistan in 1992. As many of us now older scholars will remember, the talk of a unified Central Asian response to the oppression of communism emerged a fortiori in modern times with the invasion of Afghanistan in late 1979. The talk then, coming from politicians, diplomats, and some scholars, was that both Central Asians forced to fight in Afghanistan, as well as those witnessing the war efforts and war costs through their lands, would in time identify with Afghani brothers and sisters with whom they shared far more in common than they did with the quote-unquote Russians. Naturally, there was a logic to this rhetoric in the proverbial sense. However, what we rarely saw during the war was any type of sustained Central Asian protest movement against Soviet power, to say nothing of mutinies among the Afghansi, the common term for veterans of the last large-scale Soviet war. Furthermore, when we anthropologists finally had the chance to visit Central Asia and talk with veterans and ordinary citizens, what we often found were people who felt that they had more in common with other Soviets than they found or considered to be the case vis-a-vis Afghanistan. This, despite one's own ideological or political position, is a testament to the success rather than the failure of Soviet unity. I remember an encounter that I had in the mid-1990s with a middle-aged Uzbek in Namangan, which is part of the Fergana Valley in eastern Uzbekistan, who in a discussion about the risks of political independence used his overcoat and fur hat to make a point. "Do you see the quality of these things?" he pointed to himself. "The alternative," he continued, "is to dress the way they do in Afghanistan. It's backward there." This was not an uncommon position, despite all of the devastation that Soviet power had caused in terms of the environment, the ecology, and public health, through the disastrous monoculture of cotton in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and to a lesser extent in the other republics. While Glasnost helped us gain a fine appreciation for all of the drawbacks and failures of communism, it did not always help us understand how rural people thought about their circumstances. And why do I mention the rural people? Because in all of those republics, they constituted majorities. And the urban-rural dichotomy continues to account for misunderstandings, I think, of contemporary Central Asia in many works of social science. While the Union is gone, a part of my presentation and the book project that I am beginning takes stock of how present, actually, the Soviet Union continues to be in the minds of so many Central Asians whom I've met, and I dare say, in the minds of countless millions whom I have not and never will. In speaking of matters Soviet in today's Central Asia, I don't necessarily mean the routine manifestations of inanimate objects, social behavior, meals, language, bureaucratic culture, or even conventions of negotiating daily life. Rather, I'm thinking about the way people whom I've met recall the Soviet Union, or, at this point, recall what their parents tell them what society and lifestyles were all about some 20-odd years ago and more. On a recent trip to Almaty, for example, I spoke to a number of people from various walks of professional life who took pains to point out to me how great Soviet education had been, how people had gone on to achieve much. In contrast, they mostly were not shy about what they think are the lower standards and quality of education today. This might not sound too shocking to any of you who have spent time in some part of the former Soviet world. However, it strikes me that it is an important appearance of the extent to which the past remains alive and well in the present. The new states supposedly would seek to distance themselves from the Soviet system and the Soviet legacy. But for any number of reasons, and some positive, this hasn't happened. As evidence that people who espouse pro-Soviet sympathies are not hidebound communists or forlorn nostalgists, people with whom I spoke would declare that they were glad that they no longer lived under communism, but that they still benefit from many aspects of how they were raised and socialized under that system. In trying to better understand and assess why after more than 2 decades we have witnessed considerably less political, economic, and social unity among Central Asia's leading ethnic groups, it may not be all that useful to concentrate on ethnic and even regional differences themselves, but instead to think about why reifying the Soviet republics as nation-states was a fait accompli before any kind of confederacy or regional unity could take shape. Despite the rhetoric among Sovietologists, as well as among Central Asians living outside of the region, there really never was a sustained set of meetings, congresses, I never realized how difficult that is, sustained set of meetings, congresses, societies, etc., that were dedicated to the promulgation and formation of such a body. Not in a practical sense. Had Kazakhs, Tajiks, Turkmen, etc. sat down at such meetings to discuss the work and how they would work through such complicated issues during the ferment of the mid to late 1980s, then this notion of a regional political power might have been possible. What I would argue is that many chose not to see that the Soviet Union had always functioned to prevent that sort of unity. Hence, the regional intellectuals would have had to learn to think this way on their own and in ways at odds with their formative experiences. Additionally, it would be a lengthy stretch to try and find the historical evidence that would show us a time recently when there was a popular movement coalescing around these principles. Pan-Turkism and Pan-Turkish congresses never extended beyond small bodies of exiles or emigres. I would exempt Jadidism, a modernizing and ethno-religious movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, because of its small scale, restricted to small numbers of young and internationally educated elites, and lack of power brokers. Intellectual movements rarely make the best bellwethers of common sentiments and willingness to take decisive action. True, Jadidism had the essential nation-building element of an intellectual class spreading nationalist cum regionalist ideas, but they seem to have lacked a state-building apparatus with the kind of leadership that could procure real power and marshal materiel. And in the end, they were no match for revolutionary Bolshevism. Has nationalism served regional peace in Central Asia? As a scholar, I admit that I favor democratization. My cultural relativism doesn't extend willingly to embrace despotism, enforce collectivism, and the kinds of leadership cults that found throughout Central Asia as typical elements of the quote-unquote Oriental way. Despite the contentions that ordinary Central Asians privilege kin groups and intimate local networks, such as Avlod, Mahala, etc., combined with great reverence for elders and strong leaders, I am unconvinced that this kind of cultural determinism explains the lack of relative freedoms and openness. In recent years, scholars have pointed out, accurately it seems, that the leaderships of these new countries privilege state building, stability, and security over democratization. And state building in this sense means less a dedication to spending largesse on updated and high-quality infrastructure, for example, but more on monumental architecture, typically in the form of ostentatious structures. As an anthropologist, I recognize that it is not part of my professional responsibility to promote democracy and pluralism, despite the fact that I cannot help but think how much more pleasant it would have made life for my consultants, as well as my working conditions, in a variety of Central Asian places during the past 20 years. Rather, as a professional, I conduct my research to try to understand and learn how mostly ordinary people think about the direction their countries have taken since 1991. Are they even interested or invested in the politics of their respective countries? And do they make connections between politics and the conditions of their own lives? And do they think that they can act, representing society and the old state and society relationship, to make a difference or to bring about change? In thinking about roads not taken and regional possibilities and outcomes that might have resulted from less rigid and nationalistic decisions regarding language, religion, minority rights, the regulation of national borders, etc., it is also fair to say just how relatively stable and nonviolent Central Asia has been. To be sure, I am neither ignoring the incidents that took place with the rise of nationalism combined with the atavism that took place at the end of the Soviet era in the Fergana Valley, nor the terrible and prolonged Tajik civil war in the early and mid-1990s. Similarly, I recognize the Uzbek government's assault on mainly unarmed demonstrators in Andijan in 2005 and the renewed outbreak of interethnic slaughter in southern Kyrgyzstan in 2010. Now, these were all terrible happenings, but Central Asia is not a region engulfed in war and violence. In no way do I seek to minimize mainly bloody mistakes of sovereign powers, bespeaking the privileging of state building, including the neglect of minorities, over the defense of citizens' rights and freedoms. Nevertheless, if we think back to the late 1980s and consider some of the politically analytic writings and their warnings about the potential for conflict within and among the new countries, many of the fears have not been realized. For example, while there have been isolated, possibly suspect Islamic terrorist attacks in the Fergana Valley, this multi-ethnic area still has not emerged as the tinderbox that some believed it would. And though it may be unpalatable, the very actions of ruthless dictators have significantly prevented the kind of bloodshed and unhinged retaliatory cleansings that have characterized other parts of the world, notably Central Africa and the Balkans. The political scientist Matteo Fumagalli, for one, points out with aplomb how the actions of the Uzbek leadership have probably done a great deal to forestall interethnic conflict and border disputes. The Uzbek state has sealed its own national borders tightly, while doing next to nothing to encourage its co-ethnics living across borders in sizable numbers, either to return to Uzbekistan or to make any sort of irredentist claims in the areas where they and their forefathers have been living continuously for generations. For the Uzbek president, the state is about territorial integrity above its eponymous ethnicity. And for different analytical reasons, Morgan Liu's position reads akin to Fumagalli's conclusion through his fieldwork among Uzbeks of Osh in southern Kyrgyzstan. Recent scholarship conjectures that the efforts to solidify state unity and integrity among the 5 countries of Central Asia mean the near complete abandonment of cross-border claims or the rights of co-ethnics living in neighboring countries, because it could be devastating to the maintenance of authority on the part of respective national leaders. Thus, it is worthwhile to point out that instances of Central Asia's leaders using nationalism to mobilize the masses against outsiders or neighbors have been rare. This is as exclusivist as nationalism practically is by nature. In Central Asia, it has not yet been wielded by the masses against non-nationals violently. Turkmenistan may be the only real exception, and those instances are quite minor. The ongoing antagonisms and animosities that have characterized Kyrgyz-Uzbek relations in southern Kyrgyzstan invites us to think comparatively about the extent to which nationalism, as a top-down phenomenon of post-Soviet ideologies, has been used to mobilize. While there seems little compelling evidence of a sort of overt mobilization, it is hard to see Central Asian nationalisms as serving to create greater interregional understanding and appreciation of differences and shared heritages. Nevertheless, the theme requires investigation. As an interesting foil to the Uzbek situation, there is the Kazakh. The Kazakhs did the opposite. They have worked to bring co-ethnics to Kazakhstan, and not exactly in a manner jus consanguinis, that is, an argument by blood or an argument by genetics, but partly as a way of offsetting the country's ethnic imbalance, quote unquote, at the time of the Union's demise. At that time, ethnic Kazakhs barely constituted a plurality within their own country. The aim has been to increase Kazakhs ethnically, that is, physically to a degree, on the remote chance that there would be some efforts to seize Kazakhstan's territory, possibly at the hands of Russia, and mainly in the north of the country. While I would be far out of my depth to speak on the demographics and social integration of the Oralman, Kazakhs who live outside of Kazakhstan, within Kazakhstan, I don't believe that anyone would make the argument that a, quote, return of people representing the diaspora from countries such as China, Mongolia, and Turkey has ever resulted, intentionally or not, in a policy designed to challenge the sovereignty or integrity of neighboring states, or as a way to imperil the sizable minority population of the world's ninth largest country. Thus, in essence, whatever hindrances to regional unity exist in Central Asia, owing to nationalist policies, these examples of the Uzbek and Kazakh cases are not demonstrably harmful. Briefly, Turkmenistan, for all of its policies of internal repression and attempts at ethno-national mind control and Turkmenification, has, with exceptions, structured a nationalism bent on altering borders, not bent on altering borders or increasing hostility toward neighbors. However, it could be argued that its zeal for what it calls bitaraflik, the word for neutrality, is almost a self-serving stance on the state's part to wall itself and its people off from the rest of Central Asia and avoid almost all cooperative alliances and agreements regionally. To look at perhaps the most dangerous period when a kind of unchecked nationalism or ethnic chauvinism threatened peace, one would have to go back to the early 1990s and the start of the Tajik Civil War. The morass of Uzbek-Tajik ethnicity in southern and western Uzbekistan is too entangled and contentious to take up now. But as many scholars know well, key areas within contemporary Uzbekistan have long been contested as Tajik linguistically, at the very least, including areas in the Fergana Valley, Samarkand, Bukhara, and western Uzbekistan. Be this as it may, it required combined efforts on the parts of Uzbekistan and Russia to tamp down revankist demagoguery about a restricted Tajik initiative to take over Uzbekistan's Tajik lands, quote unquote. This goes back to the early 90s. On the other hand, and to be fair, there is little evidence to suggest that such a move would ever have had the backing of the Tajik government, though leading Tajik intellectuals gave voice to a politically motivated chauvinism. But who listens to the intellectuals, right? So my point here is that dictatorial policies extant and advanced in Central Asia have in a way maintained peace, whereas war could have been the result of a kind of unchecked nationalism, or a nationalism designed to mobilize. Kyrgyzstan must strike many of us as perplexing, as its political and economic mix in Central Asia makes it unique. Whereas no one would argue that the procedures and operations of its government, especially in the last decade, are totally democratic, it clearly has had the most open political system. Despite its poverty and significant percentage of the Kyrgyz population living in Russia and Kazakhstan, the system is relatively open and vibrant. Still, nearly 15% of the entire population is Uzbek, and most of the Uzbeks of Kyrgyzstan live in 3 southern provinces. And in some districts, Uzbeks constitute pluralities in an ethnic sense. The inter-ethnic violence among Uzbeks and Kyrgyz in southern Kyrgyzstan that we may properly characterize as pogroms occurred in 2 significant and devastating instances separated by 20 years. Of course, the violence has never really been sustained, and the 2 sovereign states have not gone to war over these incidents. While it may be stretching credulity to blame the Kyrgyz government of 2010 for not preventing violence on the second occasion, mainly because it was a Soviet government in power 20 years earlier, it bears considering that much of the older political system, including its agents or representatives, continued to represent the Kyrgyz government and had no illusions about the simmering tensions, and class and materialist issues that helped keep these related but different peoples in an uneasy relationship. Having researched these very issues myself in the mid-1990s in situ, I know the situation. Whatever complicity there may have been between representatives of the Kyrgyz state and those who committed violence and murder toward Uzbeks in Osh in 2010, the one fact that is inarguable is the very failure of Kyrgyzstan to safeguard its largest minority. A failure that significant speaks volumes about the ineffectiveness and weakness of the state. Also, it can be seen as an irony because, again, we tend to think of relatively open state systems with multi-party competition and a generally low degree of nationalist chauvinism as being a place where interethnic violence would be unlikely to occur. Perhaps we could reconsider this case not so much as revenge of the past, but as a revenge of materialism and emotions. Indeed, Stuart Kauffman argues in his book Modern Hatreds that a symbolic politics theory accounts for fears, pride, and the will to dominate that undergirds many cases of interethnic conflict. Theoretically, there is salience for this position in the southern Kyrgyzstan case. In addition, political scientists such as John Heathershaw and David Lewis argue that these governmental failures of security and subsequent mob violence, in part, are attributable to what they characterize as a particular virtualness. That is, the virtual state and virtual politics. Basically, they claim that virtualness is akin to the absence, and that the outer shell, if you will, of its political and governing structures mask an internal lack of authority, will, and control over violent and chauvinistic forces, no matter how small they are. Of course, they see this also as partly the responsibility of international organizations, but we'll leave that aside for now. Okay, so credibility and alternatives of economic independence. To reiterate, my argument asserts that for 20 years, the independent countries of formerly communist Central Asia, and specifically their governments or political leaders, could have done much more to advance the relative wealth and well-being of their citizens had they chosen less nationalistic ideologies, less isolating politics overall, and less rights-depriving policies toward their own citizens. Moreover, the independent nations of Central Asia have done relatively little to cooperate with one another via treaties, agreements, blocs, etc. Whether discussion concerns the death of the Aral Sea, which is now, to all intents and purposes, pretty dead, or the use of water sources for hydroelectricity. We could examine both the Customs Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as relatively weak structures apropos of regional unity. While scholars argue the pros and cons of true benefits and engagement within this SCO, as it's called, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, specifically if it provides security for the member countries and opens up greater markets and economic cooperation, the fact remains that leaders themselves reject pluralism in their own countries by claiming these are only Western concerns and do not reflect Asian mores and Asian values. While this so-called Shanghai spirit may be relevant, there is also a danger that the call to be more culturally relativist and respectful of differences simply provides cover for authoritarianism, nepotism, dictatorship. As a de facto leader of the SCO, China may have no reason to be concerned with human rights and pluralism. On top of this, there have been many incidents of hostility among Central Asian states and generally cold relations among several of the regional players, whether we are discussing animosity over natural resources, especially water, environmental problems, interethnic violence, wealth and poverty issues, strict border controls, etc. I would remind people to consider relations between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Could be one factor in there. The argument rests on a counterfactual, I realize, but we do have international cases of cooperative blocs with somewhat more favorable results, such as the EU, NATO, ASEAN, AFTA, and the South American Mercosur. I have just pointed out that cases of authoritarian rule may have furthered peace and stability, while a case of openness and pluralism has not. But this really doesn't prove anything because of the alternatives that many push for, but that Central Asians have as yet to achieve. That's it for water here. Now, there are scholars who argue along with politicians and diplomats, that the Central Asian countries have to find their own road to peace, prosperity, and democracy. One cannot impose a model or under-differentiate, as anthropologists like to term it, given the conditions and circumstances that characterize the most obvious aspects of immediate post-Soviet systems and socio-political norms. Central Asian people themselves are often wont to say, "We were never politically independent. We lived under communism for so long. You have to give us time to develop as you did." There's no doubt about the sensibility of these declarations. But I think many will share my sentiment that while it would have been foolish to expect free and open systems to blossom overnight, it is not as if millions of educated and worldly Central Asians are incapable of rapidly adopting some modified, open, and democratic systems extant in many parts of the world. It is a relatively straightforward case of the Soviet system being alive and well into the present and perhaps beyond. Revenge of the past, indeed. Lest we forget, in the late 1980s, there were various popular movements or popular front-type organizations throughout Central Asia, some of which had been influenced by the political ferment in the Baltics and Russia. In Central Asia, groups such as Birlik, Erk, and Rastohez in Tajikistan stood for alternatives to communist politics. True, they could espouse principles that were not always so democratic, but they were competing for ideas. According to Larry Markowitz, these movements were squelched for a few different reasons, but mainly they fell victim to the more skilled and clever machinations of the local politicians in their respective settings. And as these neo-communists renamed themselves People's Democratic Parties, always remember they're neither, right? They zeroed in on alternative politics, successfully crushing competition by controlling popular sentiment and discourse to show that the alternatives were dangerous for national well-being, and that such organizations even incited violence and conflict. Lastly, last topic for today, is to talk just a little bit about religion. So, between nationalism and sovereignty, or between independence and non-regionalism, is religion. That is, that religion should have been a bulwark to unify the entire region. Recall in the 80s that for scholars of Central Asia, including well-known people like Bennigsen, Michael Rivkin, Helen Karev-Kaus, Islam could prove that unifying bulwark to challenge Soviet rule over the Central Asians. In the late 1980s and through the early 1990s too, there is little question that Islamic practices, worship, and politics constituted an awakening that was opposed both to Soviet rule and even to the new sovereigns. On the other hand, there was never really any question that any of the independent governments were going to allow Orthodox Muslims to form separatist organizations that could challenge their rule. The exception would be Tajikistan, where the Islamic Renaissance Party developed as an overtly political challenger for state leadership, though short-lived. But nowhere else in Central Asia was the idea of any organization embracing faith and favoring a supranational state tolerated. To the contrary, in countries such as Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, the one international Islamist organization that propagandized on behalf of a Muslim state, or really a caliphate, was labeled as a terrorist organization. That's the well-known Hizb ut-Tahrir, whose members have been both hunted and arrested, mainly out of existence. While most Central Asian leaders embraced Islam only in the most superficial and symbolic ways, with little acknowledgement or support for religious practice and the importance of faith in the lives of their respective citizens, only the leadership, or president more accurately, of Turkmenistan embraced Islam as a way of showing the public that theirs was indeed a Muslim country, but that Islamic activities and worship would reflect particularly a national way. Turkmenbashi, the late and unlamented Sapir Murat Niyazov, hardly emphasized the universality of Islam. What he did was help to invent a nationalized Turkmen Islam. Actually, whether you're a Muslim or non-Muslim, it's a very disturbing thing to see mosques covered with his slogans, knowing how absolutely sacrilegious that is in the Islamic faith. The viciousness with which anti-religious or anti-Islamic politics have been conducted by the Uzbek leadership has been only too well documented. One could argue that there is no greater anti-Muslim Muslim state on earth than Uzbekistan. And yet, there is nevertheless a vibrant and growing development of Muslim religious worship throughout Central Asia. However, one can be sure that it is very carefully minded and regionally controlled. all leaderships are secular, and none wants religion used as any kind of supranational or extraterritorial ideology that would in any way damage the image of the independent states or challenge their laws and integrity. Chris Hahn and Matthias Pelkmans said much the same in an article when they compared the Kyrgyz and Turkmen nation-states and their respective outlooks toward religion. On the other hand, political scientist Ajay Patnaik, an Indian scholar, doubts that Islam, as historically rooted and observed in Central Asia, could serve as a unifying political force because of the very diversity of Muslim practices and sects, including the syncretic manifestations of Islam and much older faiths in parts of the region. The historian Joanne Gross argued similarly at the outset of Central Asian independence more than 20 years ago. This is the argument that should be taken warily, that Islam is simply not deep-rooted enough to galvanize these diverse peoples. Still, it's worth serious consideration. From the time of the Russian Empire's incursions and controls over Central Asian peoples through the Soviet period, scholars often pointed out that the Russians spent much successful time and energy in keeping Central Asians from unifying over language, shared lifeways, religion. In short, everything that anthropologists such as myself would say form the foci of our studies in culture. They labored hard over territorial divisions based on what they considered the proper balance or mix of ethnic and ethno-linguistic populations. They figured out who would get certain cities based on an ethno-national concept, as well as in which territories certain resources should lie. And they even crafted ethnic identities in places where people had not used such terms to designate themselves, but rather identified themselves in other ways, especially among nomadic groups in the borderlands of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and throughout southern and western Afghanistan, to mention just a few areas. What we found now is that what we were told for decades was what the Russians and Soviets had planned all along to divide and conquer peoples is something that we need to really question very seriously, because there were many other motivations in mapping and territorializing the peoples of Central Asia. The divide and conquer idea may really be overturned. Today it seems that while all kinds of interesting questions have been asked about identity formation, shared and dissimilar attributes of Central Asian languages, comparable beliefs, etc., the respective states and their newest cadres of scholars and politicians are involved and complicit, willingly or unwillingly, in a localized and nationalistic way of continuing to carry out the Soviet mission of separate ethno-national entities. So, to conclude, I'm going to finish by stating that sovereignty in Central Asia must not be judged however contingently we may view its birth. Till this point, political sovereignty has been intimately bound up, mostly with Central Asian regime maintenance, except maybe in the Kyrgyz case. I think there are good grounds to assert that Central Asian state formation and the concomitant labors to forge national ideologies have resulted in some very separatist and off-putting nationalisms that seem till this time still not to have led to any serious cross-border conflicts or wars. One may even argue that national ideologies have helped keep peace in Central Asia, however uneasily. By examining major issues pertaining to sovereignty and regional cooperation, namely national policies affecting titular ethnicity, economic development, and religion, I'm trying to show that for just over 20 years, we have seen precious few efforts directed towards supranational, regional integration and cooperation, which turns out to be a reversal of sorts for what more than a few scholars and international analysts reasoned would be the post-Soviet experience for Central Asia. Who could have foreseen that Soviet-style regimes and leaders would have taken power and tied national ideology directly to their own leadership? I think that in large part this is attributable to the entire Soviet system and its successful ideology. Lastly, unless and until there were to be a major break from the Soviet legacy, we more than likely will continue to see increased strengthening of the current nation-state establishment in Central Asia, wedded to the very founders of political independence. Thanks so much for your attention. Happy to.